Okay, here we go. So welcome everyone to our virtual brown bag session for April. I am Alec Beckham, the Assistant Director of Learning Strategies for Classroom to Community, formerly LCMC. Today, we'll be treated to a conversation centered on becoming a culturally responsive instructor and kind of the necessity for this endeavor. Our presenter, Victoria McQueen Creek, is a 2021 Facing Race Award honoree, 2020 Minnesota Women's Press Changemaker, and a performance improvement specialist. She is also an art of hosting practitioner, a Baldrige performance excellence evaluator, respectful conversations facilitator, among other things. In addition, she's the founder of Organization for Full Participation, a performance improvement and organizational effectiveness firm focusing on equitable results through policy, practice, and situation analysis by providing strategic interventions that close equity, knowledge, performance, and skill gaps. So with all of that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Victoria.
Thank you so much, Alec, and thank you for allowing me to, inviting me to be with you all today. As was shared, and as you can see in my bio, my name is Victoria, and I stand on the rocks of freedom and liberty. I sing the river songs as an advocate for justice, and I grow trees of patience. One of the things that is really important to me and the Organization for Full Participation is several values, and those include identity, intersectionality, inclusion, and intentionality. Hence the number 4 in our name. And so today, what I hope to be able to do is to lean on my experience in higher ed and my education. I was on the road to a doctorate in education when the college that I was attending closed its doors. So I was 3 chapters in on my dissertation when that happened, and I just haven't found the time to continue that process at another institution. So I'm going to lean heavily on that experience and expertise today with you all as we think about what it means to become culturally responsive in our teaching practice. I should probably share my screen. So I will do that, or else I'll just be talking and rambling. So what we get to do today together is to take a look in the chat. I welcome you to introduce yourself and share what you know, one thing that you might know about culturally responsive teaching right now, or one thing that you're interested in knowing about culturally responsive teaching. That's going to be really helpful to me as we move through this session to make sure that it is one that meets your needs. So that's very helpful for me. So if you'll go ahead and do that, that is appreciated. Additionally, we're just going to kind of introduce culturally responsive teaching to you and share why this approach might be useful, one useful approach. We'll go over some principles of culturally responsive teaching, and I will also introduce the 8 competencies of culturally responsive teaching and share with you an action planning template that you can use to create a development plan for yourself should you choose to pursue this approach further in your instruction. Let's take a look at the chat. Thank you all. Yes. It is based on, it's a brain-based approach. Lovely. All right. Whilst those you're introducing yourselves in the chat, I want us to think about what learning is like, right? Learning is really a challenge, right? Teaching and learning are challenges. But the key here is to make sure that students are deeply engaged in learning for longer periods of time in ways that are meaningful and made relevant to their lives. That's what culturally, at the end of the day, culturally responsive teaching is all about, is making sure that students can relate the content to their lives and that the content is made applicable to their lives. So this, the learning pit is one way to understand what learning might look like from the student's perspective, right? So we have this introduction of new material concepts and things of that nature, and we just don't understand. We recognize that it's hard and sometimes we want to quit. This is what learning really feels like, right? And then we might hit a brick wall, like have no idea what and how this concept or issue might be meaningful and useful in life, and we might want to quit. With some targeted approaches to instruction that reach and connect with our learners, and the way that we do that is to get to know who our learners are, we can help them come up the other side of this pit where they're willing to not only try again, but to make those mistakes, get some help, and see some success, right? So the key here is for folks to be able to master whatever the concept is that is being introduced. And we do that by making sure that content is relevant to our learners and that our approaches are culturally responsive, meaning that we have taken into account the cultural backgrounds, the differences and similarities that are between us and our learners, and between our learners and themselves and each other, and being able to be effective at drawing that kind of connection out and helping learners see those connections more deeply and intimately. So we are going to take a brief look at this video to kind of get us in the right frame of mind for this workshop. At least I hope it's a frame of mind that might be useful. So we're going to take a look at this video. Please let me know if you are unable to hear.
So the series is called How Do I Know? And a lot of times when people hear the phrase, how do I know? The next thing they say is what? How do I know what? But the key really isn't to know what, the key is to know why. Because when you know your why, you have options on what your what can be. For instance, my why is to inspire people to walk in purpose. My what is stand-up comedy. My what is writing books. My what can be going out with some friends to eat. In fact, another what that has moved me towards my why is a web series that we have out now called Break Time. So every Wednesday at 3 o'clock, you should subscribe to the channel. We do a series called Break Time on YouTube. So 3 o'clock, we drop a new episode. One episode in particular, I'm about to show you a clip to. We were in Winston-Salem. So Break Time, this is how it works. I travel the country, I do stand-up comedy, probably an hour, hour and a half at an event. And in the middle of my show, I'll just sit down and start talking to the audience. And funny just happens. Or I'll meet somebody who's really interesting. So I met this one guy, and he said that he teaches music at a school. I was like, all right, you teach music, you know, can you sing? And then I'm just gonna show you the clip. Check it. So you're a musical director. Cool.
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Go ahead.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Wow. That bro could sing, you know what I'm saying? All right. Now, what you give me the version is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick, if you know which version I'm talking about. Just see if that exists. Let me see what you got.
Amazing grace. that saved a wretch like me. Right now I'm found, was blind, but now I see.
So here's the thing. The first time I asked him to sing, he knew what he was doing. The second time I asked him to sing, he knew why he was doing it. When you know your why, your what has more impact because you're walking in or towards your purpose.
So I share that video because for me, it becomes really important that we center our conversation today around your why you might choose to approach your instruction when it becomes appropriate to do so with this culturally responsive method of connecting with and connecting content to your learners. So what I will invite you to do at this point is to, in the chat, share your why. Why do you teach? Why are you involved in adult education? Why is that you are doing this work, that you volunteer, or that you support these adult learners in this way? Why? What's your why? Okay, and we're seeing some good, interesting answers that we relate to this journey as an immigrant, developing social equity and empowerment. Absolutely. Whys do we have? Most impact on our lives has been our teachers. To learn from others' experiences and worldviews, absolutely. Keep them coming. Empower community members. Oh, that's beautiful. Helping learners deal with barriers they may not yet have resources to manage. My goodness, yes. Filling in the gaps, helping them identify the gaps. As a performance improvement girl, that's kind of very near and dear to my heart. Identifying barriers and gaps to where we want to be. Well, keep those coming in. I'm loving this. Language is incredible, isn't it? Yes. Learn from others and help them meet the goals they want to achieve. Absolutely. Keep them coming. I want to introduce you to the cultural tree, the tree of culture, as a metaphor for thinking about the importance of culture in the work that it is that you're doing. Culturally responsive teaching really just involves connecting, right, academics to our learners' daily lives, their cultural backgrounds and their concerns in ways that support engagement, achievement, and empowerment. So all the things that you all have been saying in the chat about why it is that you teach. Gloria Ladson Billings introduced the term culturally relevant and pedagogy to describe a form of teaching that calls for engaging learners who experiences and cultures are traditionally excluded from mainstream settings and content. And then Geneva Gay came along and built on that work and coined the term culturally responsive teaching to define an approach to teaching that emphasizes using the cultural knowledge, prior experiences, frames of reference, and performance styles of ethnically diverse students to make learning encounters more relevant and effective to them, right? And so how then do we figure out how to make learning encounters relevant and effective to our learners, but to get to know them? So one of the things that we have to be able to do is understand who our learners are. In this kind of delivery model with the webinar of Zoom, I won't be able to really demonstrate because we can't have the free-flowing conversation that I typically have during this time. But what I want you to think about is, how do you typically get to know your learners? How do you get to know what is important to them with regard to their culture? The observable culture, the leaves of the tree. How do you get to know what is shallow, the unspoken rules that guide our behavior that you can't typically see, but really are there, right? And then that deep culture, that unconscious beliefs and values and norms that absolutely frame our behavior and our relationships with one another. This is a place where there is intense emotional investment. And when we are engaging across cultures, it is really important to be able to build trust and rapport with our learners. And we don't do that unless we are intentional about our relationships that we are building with these learners, so that we can extract what is important to them and ensure that we are encouraging and supporting their development, right? And making those learning encounters more relevant and effective for them. So the student-teacher relationship is what is at the heart of culturally responsive teaching, and that requires trust. Students that don't feel safe are not willing to risk failure. And as we looked at that learning pit, failure is part of the learning process, correct? So if we don't take risks because we're scared to fail, then we're not going to grow academically or personally. And so we want to be able to ensure that students are engaged and are able to take those risks so that they can grow. Zaretta Hammond, in her work, and this is the tree is from her work, created the culture tree as a way to understand culture. And so when we think about these things, the observable concrete elements that are easy to pull in are useful for us to be able to connect at a really superficial level with our learners. That shallow culture, the level that is those unspoken rules, are more difficult and require us to have a little bit of a relationship with our learners. And those deep culture means that we have created and if we can share those deep intentional cultural levels of culture with one another, it is a way of making sure that everyone is included in our instruction. Because instruction is not culture neutral. All of our choices as instructors, all of our decisions about our approach and our practice of teaching are culturally influenced. So we have to know our own culture as a starting place in order to be able to recognize when there are meaningful differences between ourselves and another student, so that we can adjust, so that we can be responsive to those needs of that particular learner. You can readily recognize those differences and use a different approach in your teaching practice. Ensure that you have materials that are going to connect with your learner and things like that. So knowing ourselves is the first step in being a culturally responsive teacher. Understanding what your surface, shallow, and deep cultures are will allow you to be more able to see what is different, and also what is common that you can draw upon. So what I want us to do now is, as we pause and kind of try to take in that information that I just shared, I'm really interested in having you all think about your own identity, your own culture. Identify in your mind one or two surface, shallow, and deep culture features that you experience. How might someone outside of your culture group view or experience those same shallow, surface, and deep culture features? It becomes really important to not only understand yourself, but to think about ahead of time how it might be received or perceived, right? That is where we can then make adjustments as necessary, depending on the cultural background of those who we are serving and teaching. So think about that for a moment and consider those three questions that are on the screen. And I'm going to give us 2 minutes to really think about that. Not a long time, since we don't get to have conversation back and forth like I would have anticipated, or like I would have preferred. So think about that. I'm going to stop talking and you all think about that for 2 minutes, and then we'll continue in the chat with an activity. All right. So hopefully, I know that wasn't a lot of time, but just I wanted you to start thinking about how culture shows up in your life, because then it becomes, again, easier to recognize those meaningful differences, those deeper cultural differences when necessary. So how have you recognized and integrated these forms of culture, these levels of culture in your teaching practice? Have you leveraged culture in your teaching practice? In the chat, why don't you go ahead and respond to the prompt on the screen there? And if you haven't consciously recognized or integrated culture into your teaching practice, what might that send? What kind of message might that send to your learners? So in the chat, I am hoping to see some. I am shallow learners from the so math is always bring something into the broader space of class. Here with Easter, over, all of those fell around the same time. Oh, yeah, true. Great. Keep those answers flowing in to the question as to how you've recognized and integrated culture into your classroom. One of the things that I like to do is to help us embody what it might feel like to do things differently, right? It's all great and lovely to have a theoretical or conceptual idea of what things might feel like, look like, sound like. And at the same time, it becomes really important to kind of embody that. So I want us to do a little bit of experiment here, activity, as we begin to shift our conversation towards the principles that we might choose to leverage in this approach. How might practicing culturally responsive instruction feel, right? So what I want to invite you to do is to grab a pencil or a pen and a sheet of paper or a scratch pad or whatever you might have handy. And when you have that ready, go ahead and sign your name. Once you've signed your name, I want you to switch hands. So now put that pen or pencil in the other opposite hand and sign your name again. After you've done that, so you've signed your name in your dominant hand and then your non-dominant hand, I want you to think about what's the difference in those two actions. What did you have to do in order to accomplish that second task, right? What was necessary for you to do in order to do that? How successful were you at being able to do that? I'd be interested to hear if anybody would like to put in the chat what that process was like for you to intentionally have to write your name with your less dominant hand. I don't know if there's a way for folks to share verbally. I don't know how they might do that. But that's also something that we could probably work out. But I'm interested in knowing what the difference in those two actions felt like for you. What did you have to do to accomplish that second task? Mhm. Yes, Betty. Intentional, more energy, concentration, yes. How did it look? How did that second one look as compared to the first one? Signature. A lot less nice looking. Less smooth throat, some unrecognizable stuff. Yeah. Right. Doesn't look like the one that you've practiced for however many years that you've been signing your name the way you typically sign it. Right? So being able to recognize ahead of time that particularly a new process or a new approach is not going to look, feel, sound like your typical work. And you may not also get the results that you are looking to get immediately. It takes practice. It's taking you a lifetime to sign your name comfortably without thinking in a legible way with your dominant hand. Thinking about this approach to teaching and instruction is also something that is going to be less recognizable, less smooth, might not look as nice, might not feel as good, right? Because it's not something that we practice. But with practice, of course, it becomes more recognizable, much more smooth, and less conscious and rigorous in order to accomplish the task. So I just want to help with any kind of a change. I like to help us embody what that might be like. And so this is an activity that can really demonstrate for not just ourselves, but for our learners, what things might feel like when we're trying something new. Thinking about that learning pit. No, we don't know what it is. We're trying to get to it. We're trying to get to the other side, and it is going to take a lot of work and practice to get to there. Thank you for doing that activity with us and sharing your thought. We are going to transition into the principles of culturally responsive teaching. And what I would like for you to do is on the screen, there are 8 principles, and there are many principles that can guide culturally responsive teaching. These are some of them. This is not a comprehensive list. But we're going to be affirming our students' cultural connections. We're going to be personally inviting, which means we have to be willing to share a little bit about ourselves and things like that, which is not necessarily something that many of us are comfortable just outright doing. So planning and being intentional about what it is that you do share is important. We have to have learning environments that are inviting. We need to be able to reinforce students' academic development, like their progression is important, not necessarily the final destination, but are we getting better? Are we doing more complex, challenging work, things like that. The instructional changes that are made to accommodate differences in learners is important. Being able to customize or personalize instruction is essential when we're talking about being able to be culturally responsive to our learners. The classroom is a place of both support and challenge. So not only are we challenging our learners, but we are providing the necessary support for them to meet that challenge. There is care and accountability in the classroom. The learning environment balances both collective and individual approaches to instruction. We are a society in the United States that is very individualistic in our approach to pretty much everything, right? However, that is to say dominant, the more dominant white Eurocentric practice is more individualistic. However, many subcultures within the United States are much more community-based, community collectivist in their approach to doing everything. And so being able to structure learning so that there is both individual work that is done, small group work, large group work that allows folks to engage in ways that are culturally accessible to them is important. And that we place students at the center of the learning. So as opposed to it being about what I want to teach and how I want to teach, I should say, it becomes really important to understand how your learners learn and center that in the student-teacher relationship. How do my students learn? Because that then is how I must adjust my teaching. And there are some questions that we have to be able to ask ourselves when it comes to this work. So I want you to take a look at these 8 principles that are there and choose one principle that is speaking to you right now that resonates with you. And in the chat, go ahead and share why it's resonating with you and how it shows up in your current teaching style. And again, if someone wants to share verbally, it looks like you can chat at Jeremiah, and he will make it so that you can speak. So there is a question in the Q&A that I'm seeing about microaggressions being made by students. Yeah. I might need a little more context. So, but generally speaking, I I recommend a curious, inquisitive approach to particularly learners who may be culturally not be engaging in culturally appropriate ways for your culture, but it may be culturally appropriate for their culture, and figuring out how to be ethno-relative in our approach. When it might be received as a microaggression, when in all actuality, from the student or the learner's perspective, this is how it's done. So having those really frank conversations, for lack of a better phrase, to be able to ask questions of genuine curiosity around students as to what it is that they are meaning by what it is that they're saying, helping them articulate in a way that you can then receive that message might be one place to start. Just being curious. Thank you for that question. Okay, and I'm seeing that we've got some stuff in the chat.
Hey, Victoria, I'll read those out for you. That's cool.
Beautiful.
So when Gary says adjusting to andragogy instead of pedagogy, as there are adult learners, having a role of facilitator rather than teacher.
Absolutely. Yes. That part is so important, in that we recognize that autonomy and agency are part of this process, and to be a guide, right, with students, as opposed to, I love that approach. It's how I try to how we might all want to try to approach this form of instruction.
I can say from my own experience, for number one, I taught for a while in Japan, and there was, there's a bit of reticence to kind of like have your head above your peers in that kind of context. And so as I would ask questions in discussion sections of classes, people would be very reticent to give a response. But after a bit, I revised and had them, go over things in small groups first, and then call on the group for a group response. And in that way, I tended to get much better answers from them because it was a collective response instead of just one person's idea.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Recognizing the cultural influences of your learners is really important. then to be able to adjust your instruction to meet them where they are, right? That is a developmental approach to instruction that I cannot stress enough how important it is to meet your learners where they are. And then guide them and facilitate their learning so that they begin to progress to where it is that they are trying to go. Absolutely. Right, so thinking about that, the ones that resonate with you because you are more familiar with those principles or that approach that principle might lead you towards, are there any principles that are listed that you're like, I don't necessarily do that right now, but I might be interested in elevating this principle in my instruction, right?
Looks like Joy has something she'd like to ask. Jeremiah can help her out.
Absolutely, I would love to talk to Joy.
Okay, all right, great. I was just struggling with typing too much. So I thought, okay, I'll try it the old fashioned way. So I honed in on number 6, and I struggle sometimes how to both support and challenge the students, because with technology in our conversation group, they all have their phones in front of them. And so they want to translate. That's the first thing when they challenge. So sometimes I feel like I want to just say gently, hey, let's try and explain that word in English in another way. Let's explain it in a different way instead of just looking it up.
Mm-hmm.
And, mostly they love it when they do that. And sometimes another student will explain, like I can say to someone, can someone explain what X is in English? And, but there is a tendency to always go right to their phones and try and put in the word and get a translation.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that that's really a cultural thing so much as this a teaching strategy for adults. So you have any comments? I'll go back on mute.
I think that when we're talking about adult learners and thinking about job aids and ways in which we can reduce cognitive load, I think about the tool of technology and how useful it is, and enabling learners to use the tools that are at their disposal, and also inviting them, as you said, to think about it critically and to engage, to tussle for a moment, right? Like, it's okay if you don't know it right now. That's why you're here. I think being able to really articulate and clearly in ways that students can get it, that the struggle is where the learning happens, is so important. And that missing the mark or not quite achieving or understanding the thing the first time is part of the process. And I think helping people learn that, learning is a process. It can be zigzaggy, it can be a loop, it can be all kinds of ways and you still are learning. Just begins to broaden that, the bucket, so to speak, for what development looks like and what progression looks like, and helping learners understand that it is a progress and a process. Would be my thoughts on that. Okay, let's take a look here at some culturally responsive teacher competencies. So these are the things that a competent instructor is going to be doing when it comes to teaching from this approach. So we're going to be reflecting on our own cultural lens, right? We're going to recognize and redress bias in the system. And so bias in the system looks different than bias in the individual, right? At a personal level, like that racist speech and things like that is really personal Whereas bias at the institutional or systemic level, such as housing discrimination, right, is something that we have to be able to recognize. Or if we are elevating those students who will raise their hand first, and we are more responsive to those students than those students who are more internal processors and need a little more time before they can adjust or share their understanding. Being able to recognize that there are some things that influence our educational opportunities is what that recognizing and redressing bias in the system really is all about. Do we understand those differences? Do we disaggregate our data so that we can understand what subgroups and subpops of students are doing based on their race and ethnicity and gender and sexuality, or if necessary, things like that. So breaking it down to see where in the classroom there may be barriers that reproduce disparities in outcomes for students becomes really important. Competency 3 is, drawing on students' culture to shape the curriculum and instruction. Do you have assignments where your students see themselves? Do you review assignments and instructional materials for historical accuracy and things of that nature? Do you seek to learn about your students' current existing knowledge, right? So when we began, I asked you to put in the chat, what it is that you know already, or what it is that you want to know about culturally responsive teaching. That guides how I would then present and facilitate for you. So being able to do that is really important. Bringing real world issues into the classroom. If you're teaching in some math, it's important to bring those examples that are not necessarily all Eurocentric. Being able to bring in some of that Caribbean background, as one of you put in the chat, putting in cricket as one of your examples. Great, right? Way to bring in real world. Model high expectations for all students, like being really able to believe that all students are capable of achieving success, right? And not just achieving high levels of success based on who they are and where they are is important. To promote respect for student differences. What does respect even mean and look like? Do we understand what that looks like from the other person or cultural background? Respect looks very different depending on who you are and where you're from. Collaborating with our families and local community. This is really about bringing the community in. This is more of a how do you involve the community in the classroom? What are participation barriers for your students? How do you involve others from various backgrounds in the classroom with regard to activities, practices, and policies even? And do you consider yourself a member of your students' community and things like that? And then communicating in linguistically and culturally responsive ways. It's all about making sure that we are sensitive to the ways in which our students feel more welcome and inclined to participate in the learning activities. So these are some things that you can do, and I have included, which you will get when you receive the slide deck, the resources that you can use to really hone in on these competencies and figure out where you have an opportunity to do more of what you're already doing, because likely a lot of your approaches are culturally responsive, and then where are your opportunities for you to bring in a new way of doing things, because you see an opportunity to be even more culturally responsive. So for me, it's all about identifying opportunities and gaps, and then planning on how to close the gap or achieve opportunity. So when it comes to approaching things in a different manner than we have typically done, it typically requires us to have a shift in mindset, And that shift in mindset really does involve engaging your unique lens on the world, right? And how you navigate life based on what you observe, what you think, and what you believe, and being able to shift that to engage with the new way of doing things. So what kind of experiences do you have shifting your own mindset, right? To become more culturally responsive means that you have to do something. What can you take away from the experiences with changing your mindset or the way that you would approach things to be able to cultivate a more culturally responsive mindset? And what one thing might you be able to commit to trying in cultivating your mindset and your CRT approach? These are questions that you have to grapple with if you're going to be successful at developing a culturally responsive practice in your teaching and facilitation. I am going to make sure that you have a copy of these links are active and will help you create your own plan. I really recommend that you, if you're interested in engaging with culturally responsive teaching, that you create a plan for your own development. That is how we get things done, is we plan. And we create a plan that's going to be useful for us and meaningful to us. So what I have created for you all is an action plan that you might choose to use, that's included in here, that plan for your own development. And I'll just show you briefly what that looks like so that you can see it's a pretty straightforward process to create this plan. If you've ever created a development plan for yourself or any other thing, this is not going to be earth-shattering, but really being articulate about why it is that you teach. What is it that you intend for your students to achieve based on your instruction? What are the strengths that you have when it comes to culturally responsive teaching? And what are some of the opportunities that you have? Being able to identify those things is going to help you come up with a goal or two that you would want to prioritize. And I would suggest you only pick 1 or 2 goals. You don't have to do everything in order to be culturally responsive. Pick one thing, elevate a principle in your approach, take a competency and try to embed that in your approach over time. So pick some steps and things that you will do to achieve that goal that you set for yourself. Give yourself a deadline, right? You want to be able to do this thing by whatever date, and then track your progress. Were you successful? These are things that we have to be able to ask ourselves and do for ourselves if we are going to grow ourselves. With that, I am going to stop talking and see if there are any questions that I can answer before we turn it back over.